Welcome to Career Pivots. It's December 10th, and happy holiday, happy Hanukkah to everyone who celebrated at sunset wherever you are this evening. And we're delighted to have everyone here. We are having a show tonight on pivoting to leadership, and we have two terrific guests. We did a little kind of a fun run through on that, and it was hysterical and thoroughly enjoyed it. Before we get going, Ben, would you like to tell us a little bit about, we're going to be recording everyone this evening, and there'll be time to ask questions. And Ben, you have a couple of announcements.
Absolutely. So for the Career Pivot show, we do have January and February all lined up. On January 7th, you can look forward to the show called The Big Leap, which is regarding two entrepreneurs who left their traditional established careers to start an entirely new business and an entirely new field. So you can look forward to that on the 7th. And in February 4th, we're going to have an event that's like, it'll be a networking event co-sponsored with the Graduate and Professional Alumni Association. And so you can, come to meet other people in a variety of industries and such. Look forward to those things. And prior to we take a break for the holidays and such, next week we do have a show, same time and for the human experience. It's called Feasting Wild, and there's an excellent author that they're going to be featuring there. And so you can look forward to that before we break for the holidays.
Well, terrific. Jeff, you want to put in a word or two?
If you don't mind, just to compliment that, because I always keep the must-see Yale sheet up, the programming guide. Can I share and put it up for everybody so they can see what Ben was talking about?
Oh, that'd be great.
So I can share. So if everyone just sees this, you can see some of the dates. As Ben mentioned, this is where we are tonight on digital leadership. Next week, that Feasting Wild, as he'd mentioned. We have a couple weeks off with the holidays, and then we just ramp right in. So if you just go into the year, these are all the different shows. So I encourage everybody to just join us Thursdays at 8. There's a lot to see. There's a lot to go. Thank you, Sam.
Yes, these the shows have been, we've really been thrilled actually with the caliber of the guests and the content. And in our Pivot to Leadership tonight, we're going to give a bit of a focus on doing it in the pandemic. We have two wonderful guests who've agreed to be with us. Joe Ilfeld is Yale 96. Joe, I think you were a math major, if I'm not mistaken.
Applied math, so
Okay.
I'll own that, yes.
Okay, and Joe is an executive leadership consultant, and she is works with a lot of C-suite leaders, executives, high potential managers to create more impact and influence in their organizations. We also have with us tonight a member of the Board of Governors, Peyton Randy Helm. I know him as Randy. He is Yale 70. We overlapped at Yale, actually. Majored in archaeology, wrote for the Yale Record, belonged to the Fence Club and the St. Elmo Society, served as a deacon of the Church of Christ in Yale, and was very active in helping to plan the campus response to the May Day demonstrations in the spring of his senior year. And Randy is also the dad of a Yale alumnus, Randolph Burton-Helm, 04. So with that basic introduction, I thought what we would do this evening is have Randy start off, give us a little bit of a background on his story and his pivot to leadership. And then Joe, but we'll have a pretty free form here interchange of discussion between our two guests. Randy, you want to start us off?
Sure. I don't think that archaeology is exactly what people think of as the leadership track or the way to the C-suite or whatever. But I think what it does is you can take a liberal arts education and do pretty much anything you want. In my case, my career, my life has just been one lucky break after another. I was after Yale, I did graduate work at the University of Pennsylvania. I got a PhD in ancient history, and in order to make ends meet while I was doing that, I got into part-time and then full-time academic administration. and then through a lucky break, went from student life work into development and alumni relations. Got cherry-picked to go to Colby College in Maine, which is where I live now. And I did that at Colby for 15 years, and then was called to the presidency of Muhlenberg College in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Did that for 12 years and learned a lot. Each of these jobs, I learned a lot. Then I retired, and the retirement didn't go so well because I ended up being the interim chancellor at University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth. I did that for about another year and a half before I decided I was really, really, really ready to retire. So, but you know, I made all these moves and pivots into things that I had never even thought about doing throughout my career. Certainly, if I thought I was going to be a college president, I'm not sure archaeology would have been my major, or ancient history my PhD. But it all worked out, and I learned a lot of lessons along the way. So before Joe kicks in, I think the most important lesson I've learned is keep learning. Don't think you know it all, and look for opportunities. And you know, if it looks like it might be interesting and fun, then take a chance. So that's kind of my story in a nutshell. I'm sure we'll dig deeper into some of those lessons that I've learned, but I think at each stage, you know, you should be feeling a certain amount of panic that you're in over your head, and that's a good thing. Keeps you sharp.
Well, that's a good segue, I think. Joe, you probably coach a lot of people who have been striving for a true leadership position, and then they obtain it, and panic's probably something that crosses their mind.
Panic might be something that crosses their mind, although I'll tell you, most of them would never admit to that. And I do want to say to Randy's, thing about luck, there is a lot of research showing that lucky people are actually those who are looking for opportunities and keeping their head up. So I bet a lot has to do with you, Randy. So I'm just thrilled to be here chatting about careers and leadership with all of you today. My journey is that, as Sam said, I was an applied math major at Yale, so not so leadership focused. And after that, I went and did consulting for a few years. And then I went back to UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business to get my PhD in business. And as you know, what I realized getting my PhD is I loved the academic rigor and I loved the learning part, but I was really way more social. And I didn't want to be sitting there doing research on my own all the time. Even in somewhat collaborative research, I really wanted to be out there talking with people and working with people. And so the first company I started with a friend when two of my kids were very small. And we built up that company, and I really loved the journey of entrepreneurship. And at a certain point, though, I decided, I was done with that. And so we actually ended up selling the company, which was really rewarding and a nice thing to see it come full circle. And then I decided I would check out this thing called coaching, because I'd heard, I thought it could be an interesting skill to have. And I went to the first coaching workshop that I did, and I was just sold. I knew it was a great place for me. It combined really my love of being with people and learning together with people, and, helping people make real and impactful change in their lives. And so, as I, dove more and more into coaching, I started out coaching a lot of entrepreneurs because I had been an entrepreneur and I knew a lot about that. And I moved into coaching more and more corporate leaders. And what I notice a lot about corporate these days is that you really do need to be entrepreneurial. You need to set your own frame. You need to decide what mark you're going to make, how you want to make an impact, how you want to lead your team. And you don't want to be constantly looking to others for answers. And I think in that way, entrepreneurs really sort of take something that maybe hasn't been done before and they decide what are the rules and how are they going to do that. And I see that more and more necessary in corporate life, and especially today in a pandemic, when you're not even in the office, you can't even watch a lot of people and how they're acting. You really need to decide what are the rules that work for me, that work for my team, and then how do I make that successful?
That's a really interesting path that you follow, Joe, and I think some of the same lessons that I learned is you find what you enjoy, and hopefully what you enjoy is what you're good at, and then you're not afraid to make some changes and to take some chances. The other thing I would say that I found, and it's especially true, I think, now when we have a lot of management remotely, through Zoom meetings and so forth, is there's a delicate balance that effective leaders need to be able to find within whatever the parameters of their own personal style are. But one is to be confident and project that confidence, even though you may be panicked, as I just found that if I was really thought I was going to have a panic attack on a particular day, I would work at home and then nobody would see me having my panic attack. But
now everyone gets that advantage, huh?
Yeah, but you project confidence, and that instills confidence. But the other thing is, that doesn't mean that you come off as if you have all the answers. That's a terrible, in my experience, a terrible leadership style is to be the person who knows what everybody should be doing. It's much more, I think, a much more effective leadership style if you're confident that the wisdom of the group and the wisdom of the process is going to produce a good result. And that empowers everybody who sits around the table with you to feel like they're playing an important role as well. And that's even more important, I think, now when you are not there in person. You can't give those literal pats on the back. There's a lot less body language involved. So really that way of projecting that it's going to be fine, you're confident of a good outcome, but you're counting on others to add value to the work and to the decision-making process, to the strategy. I think that's crucial.
Yeah, I totally agree with Randy. And I think, one of the things we've even just started talking about, this difference between panic and confidence, this difference between, knowing the right answer versus reassuring people there will be an answer and things will be okay. And I think that is in some ways what is really required of leadership. I mean, always for sure, but definitely now in the pandemic, is sort of walking this line of the yes and. Like, it's not either this or that. It's like, yes, there's panic and I can still be confident. Yes, I need my whole team to help and I need to step up as a leader who owns the team. And it's walking that line that I think is really hard as a leader. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's easy to say it. It's hard to do it. But I think that's really what leadership is required. It's like, yes, this is a scary time and we'll get through it. Yes, we're working remotely and we can still be, collaborative together.
So, Randy,
go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, no, I was interested. So when you were called to Muhlenberg to become president, I'm sure you had met extensively with the board as part of the search process. And did you have an agenda that you developed with the board for kind of your first day when you went in that you hoped to accomplish?
Well, no. I knew that it was important for me to listen. I knew that the institution had been through a very rough transition. The president before me had essentially been fired. And there was all sorts of tumult around that, including the resignation of the board chair. So it had been a very unhappy and unfortunate time for the college. And I thought what they need is a period of calm and reassurance. And so that was my first priority. Fortunately, one of the things that new leaders often do, and there's a reason for it, is to undertake a new strategic planning process for the organization, for the institution, which is a wonderful opportunity to learn about it and to reach out and put together people from the different stakeholding constituencies and get them to participate in the process so that you can come up with a shared vision of where the institution or the organization should be going. I always, when I was being interviewed for a leadership position, I hated the vision question because I thought it was impossible to answer it wisely. Really, you could either say, yes, I have this vision that we're going to be like the Brookings Institution of Allentown, but who am I to say that? You should say, I think we should be the best possible version of ourselves, but I need to find out what this organization is about. So when you're new, that's, I think, listening and involving others in the planning, while not abdicating responsibility. That's another, I think it's all about finding balance. It really is, but those are some of the things you have to balance. So when I got to Muhlenberg, it was really, okay, I need to project calm. I need to project collegiality, and I need to show that I'm a good listener. Mm-hmm. So those were my priorities right off the bat.
And Joe, when you're coaching somebody who's stepping into a leadership role, do you have a kind of a step-by-step process you go with them to help them think about what they're going to be dealing with in the first 100 days or so?
Yeah, I think Randy did such a beautiful job of articulating what someone really needs to focus on when they're stepping into a new role. And I think listening is so key. What I see the biggest mistake that people make is that they step into a new role and they think they have to make something big happen to show they were the right choice and that they can do it. And then what happens is I'm usually called in later because they've pissed off all their stakeholders and people don't want to work with them. And they're like, why? I don't understand. I was just trying to get stuff done here. And, they've stepped on toes. And I think it's so important, just like Randy had the sense of the environment he was going into. Like this was an environment that had been through, a tumultuous time. Like he sort of felt into that. I think what happens oftentimes is people come in with too much of an agenda and they're not listening to why this agenda didn't work beforehand. Like if it's such a great idea, maybe they tried it and it didn't work and you should know that. And so I think the first key thing is really, listening to others, setting up, even if it's Zoom now, setting up a lot of Zoom lunches, Zoom coffees, phone, if people are sick of Zoom, set up phone meetings. But you want to get to know people because it's much easier to ask people for a favor or to ask people to get on board with your ideas once they know who you are and what you stand for, and that you're not going to just try to ramrod something, on them and their department. So I think that's really key. And then, of course, as Randy also talked about, getting the support of your team. So, if you have direct reports that are working with you, it's really important to talk about what's their working style. How do they like to work? What works for them? How do they like feedback? Some people are like, oh, just give it to me immediately, right away. Other people are like, oh, well, maybe you could send it in an email first so I can sort of digest it and then we can talk about it. And similarly, nowadays with work styles, you can't just close your door, your door and, get work done. There's, Slack channels, there's IMs, there's Zooms, there's phone, there's text. And so different people, some people like them, you'd ask them a question right away. Like, anytime you have a question, just call me and ask. Other people are like, can you save those up and just call me at the end of the day, or call me in the beginning of the day while my kids are on Zoom school, and not at the end of the day when I'm trying to get dinner made and wrap up my emails. So I think really getting to know the people you're working with in a meaningful way is such an important step too. So,
And
that's go ahead, Sam.
No, go ahead, Randy. Yeah.
I was going to say, I think that, Joe, that keys into another important aspect of successful leadership style, which is it's often tempting to surround yourself with people who are like you, who you're comfortable with. And while, having a certain comfort level with your teammates is obviously a good thing, I found that I wasn't well served if I chose people who duplicated my skill set or my personal style, and so that we would have, different. At one point, I was telling the senior staff at UMass Dartmouth, I said, we're kind of like the Avengers here. We each have our own superpower, and I need each of you to exercise that. Well, some people are wonderful spatial thinkers, and others are good data-driven. Others have very high emotional intelligence. And if you can capture all of those skills and build a team, and everybody knows that their skill set is valued, even if they're very different from you. I think that is very important for a team that's going to be able to face challenges together.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll just add to this point. I mean, I think what you hear now in the call for diversity, whether, it's diverse backgrounds, diverse cultures, diverse how we look. I think that it's getting the skills that you talked about, getting the different ways of approaching problems. But then what is really required of you as a leader is changing your leadership style so you can actually hear all those different things. And you can and that's really the inclusiveness part of like diversity and inclusion. It's not just having different people sit around the table with you, but it's making sure that there's really space for different voices. Yeah.
And I think that's, when you're meeting with Zoom, it's both more difficult, but also in some ways easier to know if there's one speaker who's constantly popping up and doing all the talking. Sometimes it's easier to notice.
To just mute them? No, I'm just kidding.
Well, you could. That's probably not the best strategy. But but the other thing is, as you were saying in an earlier conversation we had, Joe, is that a lot of the glue that holds the team together is that informal interaction, that that sort of checking in, that sort of asking, while you're getting your coffee or whatever, asking, how did the kids' soccer game go or whatever. And that is very, very difficult to replace. And maybe you have some tips for folks about how you recreate that glue when you don't have those informal moments that a team really needs to thrive.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one thing, just because you mentioned Zoom, I'll just go backwards. For those of you who are on here and use Zoom and, WebEx, Teams, they all have some version of these features. But, a great thing to do is, one, to put people in gallery view when you're talking. So you can sort of see when someone's, like trying to cut in or trying to say something. You can get some of those things that you would get around the, office table, the conference room table. And the other thing is to use things. Oftentimes I'll have people use gestures like, hey, what do people think of this? Scale of 1 to 5, how good is this idea for you? And have people do these sort of voting things or throw up fingers. One, it gets everyone involved, but two, it's really easy to survey the Zoom room quickly and see like, hey, are people behind this idea or are there still real reservations? And, using polls in Zoom is another way that, you can just sort of quickly look at data and ask people, polling questions. So we have some of this fun technology that's very different than a conference room, and I just encourage people to play with it because it can make meetings more inclusive.
I had a variation on that worked both in person, but also works on Zoom, which I call the bobblehead poll technique, which is, you look around the table, and if everybody's nodding when somebody else has an idea, that's affirmation, and you can see that on the Zoom gallery view. So the bobblehead approach can tell you a lot if you do tune in to sort of how other people are responding to whoever is coming up with ideas. One other thing, Joe, we talked about earlier was the idea of giving others credit for good ideas, and in fact opening up opportunities for them to bring those ideas forward. So I often found if I had a group around a table and we were trying to make a decision about something, I would be the last person to speak because I was the president, and ultimately if I'd said whatever I'd said, there are a certain number of people who would just go along with it, which would not get the best result all the time. So I would rather go all the way around the table, and if at the end, if I could say, I really liked Jane's idea about this. Let's explore that a little bit more. Makes Jane feel good, makes everybody else feel like, that I was listening to everybody, and that I don't have to always get my way and be the big expert on every single topic.
Yeah.
I think
going back to your,
excuse me, if I could interject, in that discussion we were having a little bit ago, was the idea, Randy, when you've got key stakeholders at the table, you've got to actually, the buck stops with you. You're going to have to make the decision. You're going to disappoint somebody. Maybe there's a budget issue. Are we going to keep the squash program as part of athletics? We're hemorrhaging money in this pandemic, or are we going to turn it into a club team? And what's that going to be the impact on alumni? Whatever it is. How do you deal with the people you've disappointed?
Well, I think you have to be sensitive to what they're feeling and what level of investment they feel in something, and you have to make sure that they at some point feel that they get a win, and that may not be the win they get, but eventually, if you value them, if you really think they are adding value to the team, find a way to honor that value. So yeah, you do have to make decisions. And there was when I first got to Muhlenberg, the big complaint from everyone, students and faculty and staff, was there wasn't enough parking, and we needed, we had a grant that would give us like 1/4 of the cost of building a parking garage, and of course the other 3/4 was going to be millions of dollars. That I thought, if you knew the Muhlenberg campus, you would know that people didn't want to walk more than half a block from where they parked, and that was ridiculous. So I just kept sort of putting off the various plans. We did some modest parking rearrangement, but eventually I said, about 3 years in, I said to one member of my senior staff, I said, I noticed people don't complain about the parking anymore, so I guess I was right. We didn't really have a parking problem. And he said, no, they don't complain about it anymore because they know you're not listening. So, but occasionally you have to take a stand, and people aren't going to be happy about it. And but if you can have a certain amount of self-deprecating humor and not come across like you're, Genghis Khan, I think you can make those decisions, and people will accept it.
And I think, that's a great story. I love it. I think one other key thing to think about is, what do people really care about? Like, what do they have in common? So, with parking, it's like, okay, well, maybe what they cared about is like how do we work more efficiently? How do we, communicate, how do we get across campus when we really need these things? So, maybe it's parking, but maybe it's, maybe it's central meeting spots that people can meet for coffee so they don't have to walk all the way across campus or something. But I think also as a leader, you want to listen for sort of like the real need underneath the expressed need. So, for parking, maybe they just were tired and didn't want to walk, or they wanted to get up later. Sometimes there's only so much you can do. But sometimes you have an issue, like I know you were talking about before, like debates about air conditioning or not.
Yes.
And, those can be, like sort of like what's underneath them is like, will students pick us? How do we compete against other colleges? So it's like, maybe it's not about the air conditioning, but it's like, how do we win these students that we really want to be winning to the campus? And that might be a much larger set of questions than just AC, to AC or not to AC.
Right. Yeah, that's a brilliant, glad you remembered that, because it's a brilliant observation. You really need to get at the root concern that members of the team have. And, generally I've found that everybody really wants the best for their organization. They're not in competition. They may be in competition with other people around the table for some resources, but by and large, if you've got a good team, they want the resources to go where they'll have the greatest impact, that'll have the best, they'll have the best outcome for the institution. Having a strategic plan and clear priorities, of course, helps everybody focus on that. So
I have a question for you too. In my kind of work and speaking on AI and the impact on our lives, and in talking to leaders about this, a couple of the themes I hear a lot are, one, how challenging it is to stay on top of the technologies that are changing so quickly that impact a business, whether it's academia or it's Genentech, a pharma company or whatever. We've got so many things that are literally changing on an exponential basis. So there's the pressure to be on top of the technologies impacting your business, and the rapidity of change, especially with the internet, how things can, the pressure to make these decisions in an environment where things change so quickly. Now, Joe, is that something that resonates with you, that you hear from people?
Yeah, actually it does. I coach, for some reason, maybe it's my math background, but I've coached a lot of people in IT and biotech. And what you often find in the IT departments, whether it's for healthcare or tech, is that the IT is the people who are processing all this change. Whether it's huge amounts of data, whether it's, big, data sets that need to get moved. Now there's a lot of robotic automation that people are bringing in to, to sort of clean out some jobs, but do repetitive processes more easily. And one of the things I really see is, I think for many years, IT was really a service department to the rest of the company, the rest of the organization. And the rest of the organization considered them as like, this is what we want, you go do it. And now, because of all this technological change and the big ask that we're asking for IT to process all this, I think business needs to be much more working in sync with IT in a way that they might not have had to 10 years ago. And I think what you're finding is that the most successful companies are able to really partner with IT to sort of understand how this technology can help them, like where it can be helpful, where it's not worth it, where the big lift is. And I think, so that's one thing that I see companies really scrambling to work out, is how to change their relationship with IT, which is often the one bringing a lot of this technological innovation into companies.
I think that's important. It's also important for leaders to listen and, and figure out where the technology can really leverage their efforts, and where it's something that it's not quite clear that you really need to invest the time and energy in doing it. And my thinking is, I've been around long enough so that, there was a time when colleges were intent on having an Ethernet connection, as they like to say, at every pillow. Every student would have his or her own Ethernet connection in their dorm room. Well, that was really important for maybe 4 years before Wi-Fi became clearly the standard. So you had all these Ethernet sockets in people's dorm rooms that nobody cared about. And people used to, we used to provide phone service in dorm rooms, and then everybody had their cell phone. So some things are not going to be worthwhile investments, and you have to be able to listen a lot so you can see around some of those corners. You think about CD-ROMs.
That's a great point.
CD-ROMs were like going to be this great thing where we could keep all this information in a very compact form. It's not as compact as the internet. There, you don't have to keep it at all. You just have to have your connection. Does anybody remember Second Life? This
yes,
sort of alternate world, and institutions were spending fortunes to develop a presence on Second Life, and why? Why? What good did it do them? And of course, now I assume that it's gone completely. Nobody's talking about it anymore.
Jeff,
it's such a great point. I was just going to say, first of all, I remember waiting in line for my Yale phone connection. So like, and I think that actually really brings back my freshman year, and clearly. But the other thing I think is that, as we talked about before, and you can see the pandemic has really thrown this into stark relief, is that you have to be much more nimble as a leader now than I think you needed to be 20 years ago as a leader. I think that command and control type of leadership style 20 years ago could be much more successful. But now, as Randy's saying, like a lot of your millennials or your Gen, Zers, they might be the ones telling you, like, forget about this. You need to pay attention to this. Like, you're behind the times already. So you need to be, polling your folks and listening a lot more. And you need to be able to scrap things, like economic sunk costs, even though you've spent 2 years, getting this great Second Life, presence together. If no one cares about that anymore, like, stop throwing money and resources at it and just pivot.
Yeah. Always use the resources for something else. That's never going to be the problem. You're never going to sit around and say, gosh, we got all these resources. We don't need them. Not in my kind of institutions anyway.
Jeff,
it only happens in my house around.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just teasing. I said it only happens around my house around Hanukkah, because we have all this family who wants to give my kids presents, which is very lovely. But then they're always like, well, they don't need anything more, so they're like coming up with what they could ever possibly need. But I'm joking. Go, please, Jeffrey.
Sam, I'd like to just take the floor for a minute. You get a question from the gallery. I always find these sessions work nice if we can anyone has questions, they pop them in. So I just want to pop them in. Great discussion so far, learning a lot. And as a co-board member with Randy, learning a lot about Randy tonight. So this is really special. Much of the theme of what's been dialogued is what I would say, keeping the machine running, keeping the machine, efficient and moving well. I want to ask a different type of a question. So one of the things I do with a lot of entrepreneurs, I also work with lots of entrepreneurs from the venture capital side, and I ask them to frame out this exercise. I sort of call it 5 year out. Like, where is this whole thing going to be 5 years out? And I like 5 year out because it's far enough out you can do a little dreaming, but it's not so far that it's not going to be there in about 15 minutes, right? And then working that backwards to really see what are the annual goals, for example. Turns into dashboarding and trying to keep people, abreast, maybe honest to their objectives and so forth. So I just want to get a sense of that, trying to advance your organizations, this concept of dashboarding, making sure you're achieving objectives, getting the organization itself to move forward to where you want it to be. So any thoughts on that would be welcome.
I have thoughts, but I'm going to let Joe go first. I've been talking more than my fair share, I think.
I'll just, first of all, I love the idea of, thinking 5 years out and then, sort of working backwards to where you need to be. And I think the ideas of dashboards, for those of you who are on the webinar who might not know what dashboards are, they're basically just things that you're tracking, metrics that you're tracking in the organization. So, if you're in sales, it might be the number of calls you've made, how many people wanted a second call, those kind of things, and, to revenues, costs, all these types of things. But I think the idea of dashboards are great. I think what is really key about dashboards, though, is that you're super thoughtful about what goes on it. Because, this kind of thing is like what you track is, what improves or what gets better. And I think sometimes people can get so single-minded in the dashboards that you get these negative externalities. So like an example I heard recently was, a sales organization that wanted to lower the amount of time that people were on hold, because people were unhappy when they were on hold a lot, right? Makes sense. You don't want to call them be on hold. So they sort of pushed the organization to lower the hold time. And so what that ended up happening was that the customer service staff ended up sort of answering one question and then hanging up quickly and saying like, well, I don't know about this. Call back again. Like, because they didn't want them on long calls, because then that destroyed their numbers of like how long people were waiting. So this sort of goes to this thing of like, we need to be really thoughtful about what's on the dashboards, because people can game them. And you need to think like an employee trying to get better and trying to do well at their job. How might this be gamed? And how might we not get what we want to get out of it? And so I think that is a really key thing. The other thing I'll just say, and then I'll pass it on to Randy, because I know he has something wise to say, but is a lot of companies now are starting to think about employee wellness in their dashboards too. So it's not just what they are doing, but how they're doing it and the process. Like, are people, like with COVID right now, people are not taking PTO because where are you going anyway? So, a lot of organizations are now thinking about how do they force people or, encourage people to take their PTO. So, PTO days saved up. You might think about, wellness visits, like what, how people are taking care of themselves, using a wellness program that you have in the company. So I think the idea of dashboards is amazing. So A, you need to be careful, and B, make more of what you want for the full employee experience, not just the company's numbers. I hope that helps.
There's an absolute risk in almost any decision that you make of unintended consequences. And that's really another reason why everybody has to be, to feel that their voice is valued around the table. And I found that to be the case time after time. But you used to say, oh, this is a great idea. Let's do it. That'll really help, let's say, in a college setting, that'll really help annual giving. We're going to, and then, the planned giving person says, yeah, but that just destroys the message that I'm sending. That's just, one example. You need to say, okay, what are the unintended consequences of doing this? And let's try to anticipate those and then avoid them if they're bad, or at least prepare for them if we just have to accept that that's the reality. But there will always be those consequences. So you've got to have all the stakeholders around the table to be thinking about that, to be sort of modeling the outcomes. And Jeff, as far as the where are we going to be in 5 years? I think probably with entrepreneurs, the people that you work with, they have to be much more agile than most educational institutions. They have to be able to reinvent themselves much more quickly. Whereas for the kinds of institutions I work with, it was important for them to know their culture and their niche. And yes, where do we want to be in 5 years? Who's our competition? And what are we in competition with them for? And then how do we get better at competing? But the other thing about, and that's, that led to strategic planning. But the important thing about strategic planning that I always reminded people is no plan is ever written in stone. There was a Roman philosopher who said, it's a bad plan that admits of no modification. And I would cite that fairly often, because for one thing, people who don't like the plan at least have the comfort of knowing things might change if they're vindicated. And they say, well, we shouldn't do that, we should do this. And if you find that what you thought you should do isn't working, you might go back and change it. But does help to have a plan, so everybody is at least trying to get to the same destination.
Yeah, the quote that I love that's similar is, I think, the Dwight Eisenhower quote that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable.
And there's a Mike Tyson quote, which Sam probably.
Oh, everyone has a plan until you get knocked on the head or something.
You get punched in the face.
Well, speaking of that, one of the other themes I've been hearing some about recently, we have such a division around politics in particular in this country, but it's not just politics, it's a lot of the things that lead to it. And I've actually been hearing from some leaders that there's been some challenges with some of the key stakeholders in companies and organizations, nonprofits, who have very different views on very fundamental questions these days. And how do you deal with that? I'll throw that up to Joe first. I'm actually interested, Jeff, what you're hearing in the startup world about that.
Yeah, I think I think the fact that there are so many divisions in our country is just problematic in general. I will say, because what's happened is that there are so many divisions in our country that we've stopped learning how to listen to each other and how to listen for, once again, what is the need underneath what people are talking about. And I think that, someone hears like, oh, you voted for Biden or you voted for Trump, and they have all these assumptions about, so much about you that, might or might not be true. And so I think whenever you're having these sort of huge assumptions coming into companies and sort of saying, oh, this is who this person is, or I know who this person is, I know one thing about this person, I know about them, I think that's problematic. And so I think there's two things you're getting at. One is what happens when we have very different visions for the company. And yeah, I don't think there are any easy answers for that. That's not like a 3-step process to take out divisions. But I think all the things that Randy's been talking about, listening around the table, having going around table, having every opinion heard, thinking about what are the biggest concerns? Why are people advocating for a position? What are they most concerned about? Like, what are the biggest fears? What are the biggest risks? So a lot of the things that go into strategic planning and that really in-depth thinking, bringing that to the forefront, because a lot of times what people are showing you is their conclusion, but it's, you want to know what are all the assumptions they're making to get there. That I think become important. So that's one thing, is like we have very different vision for the company. I think the other thing can be dealt with more easily, is, what happened? Are we really seeing who the person is in front of us, or are we seeing who we think they are? And that is something that I think leaders really can deal with. And, one of the biggest things that I work with leaders on is how do you start seeing that, like, not everyone is motivated by the same things you're motivated by, or not everyone cares about the same things you care about. And, you see this a lot where, some people are really detail oriented and they care about getting every fact and figure right. And other people are like, oh, anything in the ballpark is fine with me. So you can see when those two people work together, one person's going to think the other person doesn't care about quality of work. They're not invested. They're lazy. And one person might think this person is losing the big picture. They're not seeing what's important. They're not thoughtful. And, so people can have just by having different values about what we care about, people can make these broad assumptions about who this person is. And I think that's the kind of thing as leaders that it's much easier to break down and, and get people talking about why they work the way they do. It's much harder, when you have really big philosophical differences about where a company should go, as I'm sure Jeff knows, it's dealing with that with companies.
One of the first things that I did, both at two of the most important leadership jobs I had, one at Colby and one at Muhlenberg, was to give people a sort of lighthearted but still accurate operator's guide to working with Randy. And so I'd have maybe 7 or 8 points. One is, I like good surprises, but I don't like bad surprises. That doesn't mean, if you have bad news. So that basically, if you have bad news, let's get it out there and talk about it, so we don't, I'm not surprised about it later. You know, another would be, it's fine to disagree, but once a decision has been made, we have to move forward with that. That's not when you keep sort of sniping from the sidelines that, you know, well, I didn't think we should do that all along. You know, and there were a few things like that just sort of were, I thought, okay, this tells them who I am. I don't always think I'm right, but here's my expectations of them. And I think people found that generally reassuring, because I did, you know, I did pretty much give them an accurate sense of what the operator's guide should be. And, you know, was indicated, I knew I wasn't perfect. I knew I didn't know everything. So that was helpful.
And did people give you their operator's guide back, Randy?
You know,
did you get that back?
They didn't. Mostly they didn't. But we did another thing that that I had sort of a short questionnaire that I would give them once a year about sort of how can, you know, how could our senior staff meetings be? Do you find them useful? Do you find them helpful? How could they be more productive? Do you find our one-on-one meetings to be, are they frequent enough? Are they substantive enough? You know, are they useful to you? You know, is there somebody else on the senior staff who you find is particularly helpful to you, and that you think is a great member of our team, and so forth? So that, you know, this was part of the annual evaluation process, which was a pretty robust evaluation process where, you know, people. And it was also linked into planning. So, you know, people knew pretty much throughout the year they had a voice in what their goals were going to be, what their priorities were going to be. They knew that we had agreed on those, and they knew we'd be talking about them. So, you know, there was a sense of no surprises either way. Wasn't like 2/3 of the way through the year I said, well, you know, I'm really not happy about the marketing plan here, you know, where I never mentioned it before. So
yeah, sounds great.
Jeff, what are you seeing in the venture world in this regard? Are you seeing this come up among some of the startups you're dealing with?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would say about the venture world, which is a little bit different than some of the other organizations we're hearing about, it's a theory I have of yes and organizations versus or organizations. And, you know, a lot of the larger institutions, the Magic Universities and so forth, tend to be and organizations. And the simplest example I can give you is there's a meeting, there's a list of the participants. Your name's not on the meeting, but you ask, should I go? And they say, yeah, come anyway. You know, in the venture world and that type, it's very much the or organization. If your name's not on the list, don't show up. So, you know, just because of the nature of the beast, you know, the timings are different, the objectives are different. And not that it's you know, a cutthroat environment. It's just that, you know, you're playing with people's dollars in that regard. Not that you are in other places. It just hits much more directly. So I just find, you know, the way you need to operate in the startup environment, at least in my experience, as well as on the investor side, is to understand trade-offs. And if you have to deal with trade-offs, as Randy said a moment ago, you deal with the decision and move on to the next thing. Lots of pivots are going on. There's lots of hard decisions, and that's what you have to work by. So it can be, it's not for everybody. Those kind of startup environments is what I found.
Joe, I think you were going to say something too, add to that.
No, if so, I don't remember, apologies.
So, you know, one thing I was really struck, in fact, I was seeing Peter Salave's holiday greeting come into the inbox today. And I remember him addressing the Yale Club in Philadelphia shortly after the kind of Christakis incident had occurred, the Halloween incident at Yale. And there was a really good question I thought asked of him by a member of actually, Randy, I think your class, who was saying they'd been at Yale during the radical years. Kingman Brewster was there. And, you know, what did Peter think was one of the main differences in leading Yale between kind of that era and his era? And he said, it is the time compression due to the internet. He said, I left, you know, San Francisco on a fundraising event, got on a plane, everything was calm. The university seemed great. I had quick reports from a number of people. I landed in, I think it was LaGuardia or JFK. I got off the plane and the world had fallen apart. There was a video of a young woman in Solomon Courtyard screaming at Christakis and he was surrounded by students. He could barely get a word in edgewise. The video was by many accounts unfortunate. And he said things had gone nuts. And by the time he kind of formulated a plan, there were new videos out. And so things were constantly moving. And I guess, you know, Joe, do you see this among your, you know, your clients, challenges in this way?
Definitely. I mean, I think no, none of us have to look further than March. You know, one week we were all in the office thinking about, hey, what's this COVID thing? Or is it just in New York? Or are we going to have to worry about it here? And that, you know, the next week everyone was remote, you know, around the country. So yes, I think that the time compression for everything is so much shorter. And I think the myth is that because things are shorter, that you don't have time to have a thoughtful response, that you just have to act. And I think that's a mistake that people can make. I think what you need to know is that even as, you know, as fast as things are moving, there is always time for a pause, for a breath. You know, what we know about our brains is that when we react quickly, we're coming from an emotional place and a less thoughtful place. And, you know, when we take a second of breathing, you know, we allow some more oxygen to go to our cortex, which is higher level thought, rational thought, we're going to come up with something that is better. And so I think, yes, we need to act quickly. You can't sit on things for months. I mean, if you sit on things for months, either it's no longer an issue or you've lost. I mean, so I think, you know, for the most part, that is true. But I think what leaders are missing, and especially nowadays with just the Zooms, my clients they get on at 8 a.m., they get on a Zoom and they're on straight from 5 or 6 p.m. And they're just, you know, off one Zoom onto the next. They're sometimes leaving a meeting early to get onto another meeting. I had one client tell me, oh yeah, sometimes I do 2 meetings at once. Like I'll be listening to, I was like, I don't even think that's possible. But, you know, like this is sort of the pace that we're asking leaders to perform at. And these are, you know, C-suite executives who are being asked to attend so many meetings. And, you know, I think partially this goes to Jeff's point of like, you need to say, or you need to say, no, I can't make it to this meeting. Someone's going to have to go instead of me and give me notes. But I think the other thing is that when you're asked in meetings for something and you're not ready, to be able to take that moment, either to take that moment and say, let me think about it, you know, give me a few minutes and come back to me, or let me think about this, I'll send you an email by the end of the day. So yes, you do have to respond, you do have to get back to people, but I think you don't have to get back to people as fast as you think you do.
I think with the Christakis story, Sam, you know, that's kind of my worst nightmare is dealing with, I'm just not good at dealing with people who are all emotion and not willing to discuss things reasonably. It's just not my strong point. And I think that the few times that I've had to be in that situation, and unfortunately it wasn't anything as bad as what Christakis had to face, all you can do, I think, is acknowledge the emotion and not intellectualize it, but empathize and say, you know, this is a big problem. This is really upsetting. We need to acknowledge how upset this is making folks, and then we need to think about how we can do better. But right now, let's acknowledge the pain that's going on and the anger that's going on. Because, you know, it's like trying to make a serious speech at a cocktail party. You just can't do it. Can't do it.
So as we approach the end of our hour tonight, and we're almost there, I want to let everyone know that Joe can be reached at her website, insighttoleadership.com. Randy can be reached through his consulting company, TorreyHelm.com. And you can reach them both, I bet, through Cross Campus, which is our tremendous new platform that, Steve Bloom, how many members do we have at Cross Campus now? Anyone know the answer to that? Ben? Have a feel?
We're at like 15 grand.
Oh, that's fabulous. That's great. Well, I found it to be, you know, already very rewarding to have signed up. I encourage you all to check it out. And any last questions for our guests? I really appreciate both of you taking the time to be on tonight, Joe and Randy. Do we have any other questions from the people signed in here?
I'll just say, you know, if there are any questions, happy to answer. And also people can connect with me on LinkedIn, you know, Joe Ilfeld. You can put it in the chat box too. Or I also have a mailing list on my website. So if people want to sign up, I don't spam you. It's like once a month, but people like it. I share leadership, like the best books I've been reading lately, or just my thoughts on leadership. So if that's helpful, happy to do that, or connect with anyone personally too.
And I'll add as a final thought, anyone's always free to reach out to me for either granular career questions or more macro ones. In my role as on Yale's select list of external career coaches, I'm always happy to work with Yale alumni. I don't charge. Every interaction I've had has been just fascinating, actually. Jeff, any final thoughts?
Just hope to see everyone next Thursday night, 8 p.m.
Yeah. Okay, well, listen, happy holiday, everyone. Happy Hanukkah. And thank you for joining us this evening. Randy and Joe, thank you so much for your considered and thoughtful input.
Thank you, Sam.
Great show, guys.
Thanks.
Good night, everybody.
It was really
Have a good
fun.
night, guys.
Good night, everybody.